Hey, hi everyone. Uh, Welcome back. My name is Pawan, and as I mentioned in my first video, my goal behind creating this videos is to try covering questions which I think could be asked in interviews, especially for a front-end developer. Uh, so for today, I'm going to do to-do list. I think it's a pretty popular front-end question, and if you go to the React website, to-do list is actually an example which they have when you're trying to learn React. And there are a lot of languages which usually build a to-do list as a demo app. Cool. So let's get started with this interview. Let's get started not with the interview, but let's get started with try coding this. I've created a scaffolding code, which actually is going to be the general markup. So we have input box, uh, followed by 3 items which I've added to-do list and a delete. The goal is to be able to add more items to the to-do list and delete the ones that you have added. And you can add it by typing into this input box and pressing on submit. So that's the basic of it. Let's get started with coding. I've chosen React because I think with React, this implementation is pretty simple. And it also gives you a good picture on how React works. So while building this, you will learn certain guidelines on how React thinks of state tree and state and what should we be using for state, when to use DOM operations versus when to rely on state for updates for elements like the input box. It'll make you help think more on how to build stuff in React. So now, as we get started, I'm using React with hooks. There's already use state which I've added. So let's first start thinking of what are all going to be the components. So over here, we have form, which you see on the top. You have list, and most likely you would have an empty state, which is to be shown when there is no items available in the list. So those are usual components that I can think of. The next one is what's all going to be in the state. So the state is going to comprise of list of items, which let's call it list of to-dos. And the next one is going to be the current value. When I say the current value of the text box. So these are the 2 states that you can think of. So now let's first start with try creating the components. So as you can see over here, this is a bare minimum app. So now let's first, as I said, we're going to create 2 components. So let's create form. And form will accept props. And let's for now just return what is there within the markup over here. So let's copy this whole thing, which is the form, and let's just return it over here. And now let's include form as we would do with JSX, which is a form element over here. And now you can see that the form got added. Now let's create list. Same way, props. Let's do a return. And let's take the whole UL and li, which is over here, and let's pass all of it to this given list and paste it over here. And now let's include list over here. And now you have 2 React components and the existing app. Cool. Now let's think of what we have in the state. So as I already mentioned, we are going to use list of to-dos and the current value. So let's first start with to-dos. So we are using use state. So as I mentioned in the last video, you'll have a getter and setter. So you have set to-dos and set to-dos, and you're going to use use state. You can you're going to default the values over here as the initial one. So I'm going to use array for now. You can use even ES6 maps if you like, but for now I'll stick with array. And it's going to comprise of multiple objects inside it. And since we are going to emulate what's there right now, so you have three values within it. And let's say each array has got a value. The first one is play badminton, and the second one is going to be meditate, and the third one is going to be drink coffee, right? So now you have three, and we have created the initial state. And what we are going to do is, because the list is currently hard coded, we are going to pass to-dos to it as an attribute, which is a prop. And we're going to use the state value, which we have defined at the app level, and pass it to it. We're going to go to the list and take the to-dos from the props. And instead of hard coding this, now I'm going to use map, which helps you with creating a new array, and you can return the DOM or the React JSX component as part of it. So this one takes two values. One is going to be, the first one is going to be the item inside it, which is to do, and the next is going to be index. And we are going to return value over here, which is going to be the li as it was over here. So let's just copy paste the li. Now, instead of using the value from here, we are going to take the value which we defined in our object within the state. So which is item.value. And let's now remove the rest of it. And let's see what broke over here. So we have to-dos.map. We said item, or it's called to-do, not item. Cool. So now we are fetching the values from the state, passing it as a prop to the component, and using the value within the object to create the list of LIs. So now we have a dynamic list which is created using the state. Now let's go to the next part of it. So we have the form. What value does the form take? So I mentioned one more state value, which is going to be current input value, and set current input value as the setter, and it's going to use state, and the value of it is going to be empty to begin with. Now, one thing you notice is that this is a div. If you want to follow semantics and you have an input with a button inside, you should always use a form, not use any div elements for it, because you want to submit the form. And semantically, this is the right approach. Form comes with other attributes. If you're making an Ajax call, you can define action within it. And it also gives you ability of on submit, where if you have buttons inside it, when you would click on it, it would submit the form as part of the event that JavaScript would trigger. So in this case, now we have a form, we have a button inside. One thing that we need to ensure is that any buttons which are supposed to trigger a form needs to have a type value, which needs to be button submit. This now tells that when you click on the submit button, you're going to submit the form. And we are going to listen to the on submit of this. And let's ensure. So what did, okay. So now let's ensure over here that you do a prevent default, which is you prevent the default submission of the form. One more thing I like is ensure that all your values when you're creating are in its own line. This helps with readability. So you can see stylus below and on submit is above it. This is usually what I prefer. And if you're using TS-lint with prettier, you will get a lot of it out of box. In this case, you're not using any of it. So during an interview, it was good if you follow some good standard practices. Helps keep your code clean. So now we did prevent default, and we were listening to the on submit. Now what we'll do as a next step is we want to go and add something when you click on submit over here. So we are going to now trigger the props on submit, which we will define at the level at the place where we have the form created. So over here, now what's going to happen? So instead of let's take the value. The goal is to get the value which is there in the input box and submit. So how do you get the value of the input over here? So since we are using the form submit, so notice that we have an input box over here. We can use an identifier for the input box to get the value which is present inside it. So we're going to give it a name attribute and call it to do. You can give it any name. For now, I'm going to call it to do. Now, what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to use form data, which is available as part of your browser. And you can now you can supply it the form node. So since we have the event over here, the target of this is going to be the form. So now you have a structured form data with getters and setters. The to-do value can be extracted now using the getter of the form data. So you would say form data.get to-do. The reason I defined this name is when you're using form data, you can get the values inside it using the name attribute and get the value of it. So now we have the to-do value, and now we are going to pass it over here as part of the method, as we were expecting that within this function over here. So what do we do next? So we have the value over here. Now, as I had shown in my previous video with React, you have to work with immutability. So what is in the state should not be mutated. So you're going to create a clone of it, which is clone to-dos, and you're going to do to-dos dot slice. Since it's an array, you can clone it using slice method, which just gives you a new array back with the values inside it. And now you're going to push into this array an object, and the value of it is going to be the value that you got as part of the callback. And now you're going to set the state back, and you're going to pass it set to-dos, and you're going to send it the new clone to-dos. So now let's test this out and see what happens. I am going to click on submit. You can see that now a new value was added, and I can keep changing this, and a new value was added again. So we have at least a basic working function which actually goes and adds an item into the list. I will go into further behavior, but there's another important one. So when you're thinking of React, you should always think of state. Now you can see that over here as part of this input, I'm not using state or props. I'm actually relying on browser's own capability for updating the input box and updating the value inside it. With React, you should think of it a little differently. So what I mean by that is you're going to listen to the onChange event over here of the input, and you're going to go and similar to what I'd done previously, I'm going to ensure that each attribute is in its own line, and so is the onChange. And what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to do the prevent default, which cancels the default behavior. And similar to the way I called props on submit, I'm going to call on input change. And what I'm going to be passing over here is the e.target.value, which is basically the value of the input box at this moment is going to be passed as part of the attribute for this given function. And then we are going to listen to the same on sub. We are going to listen to the same callback over here as we did with on submit. So now let's add on input change and take the value as the input. And as we already created a state over here, which is the current input, what we are going to do is update the state with the new value. So now we have just updated the state, but we are not reading from it. If you notice, we are nowhere reading from it. So now, similar to how we passed to-dos to the list, now we are going to even pass the current input value as and prop to this component. And at the input level, we are going to use the value from the prop to assign the value into it. So now when you're typing in, the way it's working behind the scenes is the state is getting updated and React is going and updating the value of the element using the state as part of the component, which is getting those things as a prop to it. So it's not the DOM which is doing this, it's actually the React state 3 and the React reconciliation, which is now going and handling the changes in the input value. The way I can show that is, now if I were to not use the value of the input change and just hard code and set some value, so you'll see that when I'm typing in, nothing changes over here. It's always going to be the value which I put in over here. So you can see now that React is doing it. It's not the input HTML element which is doing it behind the scenes. So let's revert the code. So now we have two states which are working. One is the input value is now getting updated by the state, and there is on submit, which is also working. So now let's go into the next part. So now what do we have to do? We have to go and delete items. So how can we delete? So one way of deleting is you can basically listen to on click of all these buttons and then try looking into the whole array and check the value against the value which is stored in it, and then try deleting it, which is going to be an operation, because you might find the delete as the last one in the sequence. Is there a better way to do this? Yes. So you can use filter and you can achieve this. But what if somebody puts in two values which are same? So let's say I put add bottom, like cook food, and I say submit, and I say again cook food and submit. So how will you be able to filter this if both the values are the same? You cannot do a text match and get it. So you have to come up with something else. You need a unique ID identifier for every single node. So how can you do that? So basically, we want an ID over here, which has to be unique all the time. So there are two ways to do that. React actually has got a method called getID. If you use it, it generates a unique ID all the time. But for the sake of this interview, I'm going to create the getID on my own. So I'm going to use closure. Important concept in JavaScript. If you're preparing for interviews, please ensure that you understand concepts like hoisting, closures, event delegation thoroughly. So let's create a closure over here. So I'm having a get ID. I'm going to create an IFI. What is IFI? It's immediately invoke function. It helps you create closure. So I have an immediately invoke function. Now anything inside this, because of the way the scoping works in JavaScript, where you have block scoping and lexical scoping, a closure is created so that you can store variables inside it. And I'm going to return a function over here, which is going to be so when you call getID, you call it as a function invocation. And this is the new function that is going to be written as part of it. So as I said, closure. So what's a closure? I'm going to now create a count variable and instantiate it with 0 as the initial value. And I'm going to return over here count ++, which means that the closure inside is going to get updated with the newer value. And every time I call the getID function, I would get a new value, which is going to be incremental value of what the previous value was. So I'm going to just say get ID equals to get ID. Do the same thing over here. And do the same thing here. There was one more place where we did the same concept where we added it as an object, which was somewhere on the, no, which was over here. where we added this. So we have to do the same thing over here, which is ID equals to get ID. Looks like I have some error in my code. Where did I add? So there is no comma over here. Cool. So we have created an ID, and as I stated, because of the closure concept, we are actually returning a closure which is holding a variable inside it and returning a function which is going to always give you an incremental count. So now let's work on now you can use this to do a delete. So how can you do that? So where is the delete button? Delete button is over here, right? So we're going to listen to on click of this. Do an e.prevent default, which we were always doing before. And then we are going to call props dot delete to do. And to it, we are going to now pass the ID. So we have to do dot ID, which we got from the map over here, and the object, similar to how we had values inside it. We are now going to pass the ID to it. And now we're going to listen to from the list. We are going to add the function signature for to do delete to do, which was taking ID as the attribute that was being passed as part of the function. And now what I'm going to do is very similar to how I did it on submit, clone the list, clone the to-dos. And now I'm going to do a filter. I'm going to set the to-dos again, but this time I'm going to do by filtering from the array, which is the to-do. I'm going to do if to-do dot ID is not equals to ID. So we filter it. So now let's try it. I delete meditate. So I deleted one, which is play badminton. It got deleted. I'm going to add a new value called ASDS and do a delete. So it works. Drink coffee works. So now you have the delete also working for you. So we have, I would say, most of the functionality working. So now let's get into ensuring that we are handling all edge cases and optimizing our code a little bit and also taking care of accessibility. So what are the things that we need to worry about? So first, let's just focus on the form. In the form, remember to add up. So we have a placeholder over here. Remember to also add an area label, which actually is for the screen readers to read what is supposed to be inside this input box. As you can see, there is no attached value inside it. You can also add a label over here. It's important to always add a label. And you can use HTML for, I think, or for HTML. Give it, so give this an ID. So this is to do input. And the HTML for should be to do input. And give it a value over here, add your task. You can decide to hide this if you want. Now, the whole point is that when you click on the label, it's going to go and focus onto the input box. You can decide to hide this on the screen, but make it visible for the screen readers. That's one approach. So add a label, use HTML for, and also add the ARIA label inside it. There are a few other ARIA labels that you can add for form and buttons. Also ensure you take care of them. And if you remember in the previous one, there was even ARIA live. So if there is a form action being triggered, you can go and update the ARIA live polite container with stating that there is something that is happening when you click on submit. What is the next thing? So if you can see over here, I can submit empty values, which is again wrong. You're not supposed to take empty values. How can you handle this? Very simple. HTML forms have very amazing validations now. Try leveraging as much of browser capabilities. Don't try adding too much on the JavaScript. When I get into some design interview questions, that's usually my principle. JavaScript has to be lean and do less with JS. Just add required over here. And now you can see that if I just do a submit, the browser itself is going to validate and check if the input value doesn't have anything, it's going to show an alert. What you can also take care of is when you're doing the form submit, you only submit it if the value is present. If the value is not present, don't submit it. You can also use a trim to eliminate any spaces, because now you could have spaces over here and still submit, which you don't want to do. And the way you can handle that is by using a trim. So that's second kind of validation, which you cannot get directly from the browser, uh, because spaces are considered to be characters. And it's going to show that there are characters inserted, and the required item over here is not going to work out for you. But you can also use regex and add some validations to input if you choose to. That's another way of doing this. But for now, I'm just going to ensure that I trim it, and I only submit it if there is a value inside it. What's the next thing? So I keep pressing delete and everything has got wiped off. Do you want to show some kind of message to the user when everything is removed? With React, it's far simpler. So what we are going to do over here is that if my to-dos length is empty, I'm just going to return a message over here, which would tell the users that list is empty. Obviously, you can style this differently. You can create a separate component for it, which is empty component, which I mentioned on the top over here, and render the empty component. If you choose to over here, let's try it out. I deleted, and now I have the list is empty. Cool. So I think we have handled most of the cases that I wanted. So you have submit working. You're able to add items to the list. You're able to delete. We have taken care of some basic accessibility, and please ensure that you cover this during interview if you have time. We have taken care of some basic validations, which is empty input boxes, spaces for trimming it out. And there's one more thing that I think I missed out, which is what happens when you click on submit. You can ask this to your interviewer, whether you want to retain the value that was previously inserted, or you would want to reset the value to the placeholder. If the interviewer says that we should reset, which is what I would prefer, you can do that very simply by hooking on to the on submit, which you were already hooking on at the app level. And all you're going to do is set the current value to be empty. So let's just go and make it empty. So now you will see what's going to happen. So I've added read, and the input box now has got empty, and I'm seeing the placeholder text. Cool. So I think we covered most of it. This is very basic to do. I would always recommend also doing this with JavaScript, because sometimes interviewers could ask you to do this with JavaScript and not use React. And I'll probably cover up an interview for doing this with JavaScript. Cool. The main things that I want to call out as part of this is learn concepts like closure. Think of building applications in React, especially how you use state and update the value with an input box. And try thinking of handling all the edge cases and how you want your state trees to look like, and how you can use operations like filter to achieve delete and re-updating the state. Cool. With this, I think I've covered everything. Thank you, folks. I'm going to stop recording now. I'll cover the next presentation sometime tomorrow, the next video tomorrow. Thank you.